The man didn't even look at her face. Victor Crow stepped off his black horse in front of the crowded train platform, straightened his coat, and pointed one gloved finger directly at the woman who had just arrived on the afternoon train from Chicago. "That," he announced to no one and everyone at once, his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who had never once been told no, "is what desperation looks like." The laughter started at the back of the crowd and rolled forward like a wave. Eleanor Whitlock stood on the platform with one worn traveling bag at her feet, and her chin tilted exactly high enough to suggest she had heard worse. She probably had. But her hands, those strong, square hands that had kneaded bread dough at 4 in the morning and scrubbed floors until they bled, those hands gripped the handle of that bag just a little too tight. Silas Hawthorne watched from 20 feet away and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not for her. For himself. For every single person standing on that platform laughing at a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger because the world hadn't given her a better option. Just like it hadn't given him one either. He pushed through the crowd without saying a word. What happened next, in that filthy little railroad town, in front of half the county, would set the course of everything that followed. And if you've ever been laughed at for something you couldn't change, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye in it decide you didn't belong, you already know exactly how Eleanor felt in that moment, and you already know she wasn't going to let it stand. If this story moves you, if you've ever been the one they underestimated, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Mom. The morning the train was due, Silas Hawthorne hadn't slept. He'd been awake since 2, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp that needed trimming and a ledger that needed a miracle. The numbers didn't lie, and Silas had stopped lying to himself somewhere around the 3rd drought year in a row. Iron Ridge Ranch was bleeding out. Not fast and dramatic like a gunshot wound, slow and grinding like a man crawling through sand. The kind of dying that takes everything and leaves you just enough hope to keep suffering. He closed the ledger without adding anything to it. There was nothing to add. 43 head of cattle where there had once been 200. A bunkhouse with 6 men where there had been 22. A water agreement with the county that Victor Crow had been quietly, systematically undermining for the better part of a year. Silas knew it was Crow. He couldn't prove it. That was the part that kept him up nights. Not the losing, but the losing to a man who smiled at him in church and shook his hand at the feed store and had been destroying him one piece at a time for 18 months. The mail order arrangement had been his foreman's idea, and Silas had resisted it for longer than was strictly rational. "You need someone who can run the house," Pete Garner had said, direct as always. "Cookie's drinking again. The men are eating salt pork and bad biscuits, and they're getting ugly about it. A ranch without a decent kitchen is a ranch that loses men, and we can't lose any more men, Silas. I'm not marrying some stranger to fix my biscuits. You're not marrying her to fix your biscuits. You're marrying her to fix your ranch. There's a difference." Silas had stared at him for a long time. Then he'd gotten up, gotten the pen, and written the letter to the agency in Chicago. He hadn't expected much. The agency's fee was low, which told him something about the caliber of applicants. He'd asked for someone capable, hardworking, and willing to accept a rough situation. He had not asked for beautiful. He had not asked for young. He wasn't 25 years old with stars in his eyes. He was 41, sunburned, and practical about most things. He thought he was practical about this. He was wrong about that. The thing Silas hadn't accounted for was the town. He lived in it, worked in it, bought his supplies in it, and he had somehow convinced himself that Hartwell, Montana, didn't care much what he did on his own property. That was the lie he'd been telling himself. Small towns care about everything. They care with both hands, and they never let go. By the time he rode in that afternoon, half of Hartwell was at the train station for reasons that had nothing to do with expecting packages. Word had gotten around. It always did. And someone, Silas would never find out who, though he had his suspicions, had made sure the story had the most unflattering framing possible. That Silas Hawthorne, too broke to find himself a real wife, had ordered one from a catalog. like a piece of furniture. And wasn't that just the saddest thing you'd ever heard? He heard the laughter before he saw her. It came from the far end of the platform, a burst of it, ugly and group-shaped, the kind that happens when people have decided something is funny before they've even seen the joke. Silas pushed his horse through the edge of the crowd and then stopped, because Victor Crow was already there. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. Victor Crow had no reason to be at the train station on a Tuesday afternoon. Victor Crow had no reason to be anywhere near Silas Hawthorne's business. And yet there he was, immaculate as always, that silver-handled cane he didn't need for walking, that coat that cost more than Silas made in a month, standing near the front of the crowd like he'd been waiting, like he'd known. Eleanor Whitlock stepped off the train and the laughter hit her like a wall. Silas watched it happen. Watched her foot touch the platform and her head come up and her eyes sweep the crowd and understand, in about 3 seconds, everything she needed to understand about what kind of welcome this was going to be. She was a big woman, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying weight in a way that the women of Hartwell, Montana apparently found hilarious. Her dress was plain and dark and travel-worn. Her hair was pinned up severely. She had a face that wasn't pretty in the way that Hartwell understood pretty, but it had something in it, a stillness, a quality of attention that Silas noticed even from 20 feet away. She noticed Victor Crow first. Something moved across her face so fast Silas nearly missed it. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Recognition, maybe. But cold. Then her eyes found Silas. He hadn't moved. He was still on his horse at the edge of the crowd, and he knew how he looked. Weathered and too thin and not particularly welcoming. He'd never been good at welcoming. His face didn't do it naturally. But he pulled his horse forward through the crowd, and people moved for him because they always moved for him. And he got to her before Crow could say whatever he was clearly positioning himself to say. "Miss Whitlock," he said. He didn't reach for her hand or smile. He wasn't built for either right now. "I'm Silas Hawthorne." She looked up at him. She was tall, but he was taller. "Mr. Hawthorne." Her voice was even. He noticed that. The laughter was still happening around them, rolling in and out like a tide, and her voice was completely level. "I have a wagon around the side," he said. "Then we should go to it." He dismounted and took her bag without asking, and she let him take it without making a thing of it, and they were walking before anyone on that platform quite realized the encounter was already over. Victor Crow's voice caught them at the edge of the platform. "Hawthorne." The word had a shape to it, the particular shape of a man who knows he has an audience and wants to use it. "Is this the rescue party you've been waiting for?" The crowd thought that was very funny. Silas stopped walking. He felt Eleanor stop half a step behind him. He didn't turn around. "Best of luck to you both," Crow continued with that particular brand of warmth that was actually cruelty in a good coat. "A struggling ranch and a wife who, well, I'm sure you'll make the most of what you have." Silas turned around then. He turned around slowly, the way a man turns around when he's making a decision about what kind of man he wants to be. He looked at Victor Crow. The silver cane, the smile, the eyes that were enjoying this enormously, and he said nothing for long enough that the laughter died down out of sheer uncertainty. "Thank you for the kind words, Victor," Silas said. His voice came out flat and quiet. "You should get some rest. You're looking tired." He turned back around and kept walking. It wasn't a great comeback, he knew that. But it wasn't nothing either, and he hadn't given Crow what he wanted, which was Silas Hawthorne standing on a train platform, losing his dignity in front of the whole town. He held on to that small thing as they made their way to the wagon. He helped her up onto the seat. She settled herself with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing her own body in space that wasn't always built for her. He tied his horse to the back and climbed up and got the wagon moving without looking back at the platform again. They rode in silence for a while. The town fell away behind them, and the road opened up into the flat, wind-bitten land that Silas had been working for 15 years. The afternoon light was going orange at the edges. The mountains in the distance looked like trouble. "I'm sorry about that," he said finally. "You didn't do it." "It happened on account of me." She was quiet for a moment. "It happened on account of people who enjoy that sort of thing." "Are they always like that?" No. He reconsidered. Most of them, no. Some of them, yes. That particular man, he stopped. Victor Crow. She said the name without any particular inflection, the way you say the name of a thing you've studied and decided what to think about. Silas looked at her sideways. You know him? I know of him, she said, and her voice had gone carefully neutral in a way that he didn't have the context yet to understand. His reputation reached Chicago. Silas absorbed that. He filed it away in the same drawer as the recognition he thought he'd seen on her face at the station. He's been causing trouble for the ranch. What kind of trouble? He hadn't expected the directness of that. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something softer, something that stayed in its lane. The financial kind, mostly. Cattle going missing, workers getting paid to leave, water rights being contested in ways that don't quite make sense. He paused. I can't prove any of it connects to him. Eleanor Whitlock looked out at the road ahead of them and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, You'll need more than suspicion. I know that. Records, paper, things a court can hold. I know that too, Silas said, a bit more sharply than he intended. She didn't flinch. Then we're both people who know things they can't yet use. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd left the platform. Her eyes were dark gray and completely steady. I imagine we'll have a lot to talk about. He didn't know what to do with that. He hadn't been prepared for a conversation like this before they'd even reached the property line. He'd been prepared for awkwardness and resentment, and the long, careful negotiation of two strangers figuring out how to share a roof without actively hating each other. He hadn't been prepared for a partner. The ranch is in rough shape, he said, because he thought she deserved to know what she was walking into. Rougher than the advertisement probably implied. The advertisement didn't imply much of anything about the ranch. It was mostly about you. Something that might have been embarrassment moved through him. What did it say? That you were hardworking, serious, not looking for companionship so much as partnership. That's accurate. It also said you'd built the ranch yourself from the age of 26 and hadn't lost it yet despite considerable adversity. He hadn't written that. Pete must have added it. That's also accurate. Then I knew what I was coming to. She looked forward again. I didn't come here expecting comfort, Mr. Hawthorne. I came here expecting work. The wagon hit a rut and jolted them both, and she caught the seat rail without reaching for him and without making a sound. And Silas Hawthorne, who had not felt anything but tired for a very long time, felt something shift slightly in the vicinity of his chest. He told himself it was just relief. When they pulled up to the ranch house, the hands were standing around the bunkhouse in that particular configuration. Men arrange themselves in when they're pretending not to be watching something. Silas could see the assessment happening from 60 yards out, could feel it the way you feel weather coming, the pressure, the charge in the air, the sense of something about to break. Pete Garner stepped forward from the group. He was a big man, weathered to leather, with a face that had opinions about everything but rarely shared them unless asked. He nodded at Silas and then looked at Eleanor with an expression that was at least trying for respectful. Miss Whitlock, welcome to Iron Ridge. Thank you, she said. She climbed down from the wagon before anyone could help her and stood in the dirt of the yard and looked at the ranch house with the same quality of attention she'd been directing at everything else. Methodical, quiet, thorough. The house was a mess. Silas knew it was a mess. The porch had a board that needed replacing. The kitchen window was letting in a draft that had been letting in a draft since February. The whole property had the look of something that had been maintained by a man who was too busy staying alive to make anything pretty. She didn't say anything about any of it. From the back of the group, a man named Dale Greer said something under his breath that made two other men laugh. Silas heard it. From the brief tightening of Eleanor's posture, she heard it too. But Greer was a problem Silas didn't have a solution to right now. He was one of the best ropers on the crew and one of the worst human beings, which was a combination Silas had been tolerating for lack of alternatives. Cookie still working? Eleanor asked Pete, like Dale Greer and his commentary were simply not a part of the world she was operating in. Pete's expression shifted. something between apology and relief at the change of subject. After a fashion. What does that mean? It means he started his day early this morning and it wasn't with coffee. Eleanor turned to Silas. Is there a kitchen with basic provisions? Should be. Then I'll see to supper. She picked up her bag from where Silas had set it. If someone could show me which room is mine first. Silas showed her. The room was small and cold and had a curtain instead of a door and a window that looked out on the side yard. She surveyed it with the same expression she'd used on everything else, factual, unglamoured, and then set her bag on the cot. This is fine, she said. He stood in the doorway. You don't have to start supper tonight. You've been traveling for... I've been sitting on a train, she said. That's not the same as working. The men need to eat, and I need to understand what I'm dealing with in that kitchen. She met his eyes. What time do they usually eat? 6. She looked at the window. Then I have 2 hours. She started unpinning her hat. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. He understood a dismissal. He left. He stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, and he thought about the train platform and Crow's voice and the laughter that had rolled forward like a tide. And he thought about Eleanor Whitlock stepping into all of it with her chin at exactly that angle. And he thought, whoever she is, whatever she's carrying, she didn't deserve that. Then he went to find Pete and tell him to keep Dale Greer away from the kitchen. What came out of that kitchen at 6 o'clock changed something in the air of Iron Ridge Ranch that hadn't been right in a long time. It started with the smell. The men noticed it before they could name it, the particular combination of salt and fat and something slow-cooked that bypasses the rational mind and goes straight to the body. 3 of them actually stopped walking toward the bunkhouse and turned without thinking toward the main house, following it like animals following water. Silas was at his desk when Pete knocked. You should come to supper, Pete said. I eat later. Not tonight, you don't. The table was set. Silas didn't have a tablecloth, and he hadn't had a tablecloth in 15 years, but Eleanor had found an old piece of fabric somewhere and put it down, and it changed the whole character of the room in a way that was almost hard to look at, like something you'd forgotten existed and suddenly remembered. The food was simple. She hadn't performed a miracle with thin materials. She'd made the most of them with actual skill, which is different. There was beef stew so rich it had a color like dark coffee. There was bread, real bread, not the flat, hard things Cookie had been producing, and it was still warm enough that steam came off it when you broke it. There were pickled things from somewhere, and a pot of something that smelled like his grandmother's kitchen in Missouri, a smell Silas hadn't encountered in 30 years. 6 men sat down, and for a full minute none of them said anything. They just ate. Dale Greer, who Silas had told Pete to seat at the far end, actually looked up at one point with an expression that was trying to stay contemptuous and failing completely because his body had already voted and his body had voted enthusiastically in favor of the stew. Eleanor sat at the other end of the table and ate her own supper quietly and didn't seek anyone's approval, which was the exact right thing to do, and somehow the most powerful thing in the room. A young hand named Bobby, 19 years old and homesick since August, looked up from his bowl with something raw in his face and said, Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten since I left home. Then eat until you're full, Eleanor said simply. There's more. Bobby ate until he was full. Then he ate a little more. The other men ate in the concentrated way that men eat when they've been hungry for longer than they've admitted to themselves. And when supper was over, 3 of them helped clear the table without being asked, which Silas had never seen happen once in 15 years of running Iron Ridge. He stayed behind when the others left, helping carry the last of the dishes without quite meaning to. They'll work harder tomorrow, Eleanor said. She was washing without any apparent need for commentary. Men always do after a decent meal. It's not complicated. Most people can't do what you just did with those ingredients. Most people don't pay attention. She handed him a clean dish without turning around. There were supplies I needed that weren't there. I made a list. He dried the dish. I'll get them on Friday when I go to town. Some of them sooner, if you can manage it. The salt pork is turning. He looked at her then. The back of her, the set of her shoulders, the efficient way she was working through the dishes without wasted motion. Miss Whitlock, why did you come here? And I don't mean the ranch, I mean... He stopped. It was a large question. She was quiet for a moment. The water moved in the basin. "I came here because I needed somewhere to be," she said finally. "And because the letter your agency sent said you needed someone who could actually work, not someone to look at." She paused. "I've had enough of situations where the looking was the whole point." He thought about asking what that meant. Something in her voice told him the asking would cost her something she wasn't ready to pay yet, and he had enough things asking to be resolved tonight without adding more to the pile. "That's a fair reason," he said. "It's the true one." He set the dried dish down and picked up another. Outside, he could hear the men in the bunkhouse, the low sound of voices, someone laughing at something, not the sharp, ugly laugh from the platform, but the warm kind, the kind that happens when people have eaten well and the night is almost manageable. There was a telegram waiting on his desk that he hadn't told Eleanor about. It had arrived that morning before he went to the train station, and he'd read it twice and put it face down because he didn't know what to do with it yet. It was signed with initials he didn't recognize, but the information in it was specific. Specific in the way that information is specific when someone has been watching very carefully for a very long time. It was about Victor Crow, and it had come from Chicago. He dried the last dish and said goodnight to Eleanor Whitlock and went back to his desk and turned the telegram face up again and read it a third time. And this time he read it thinking about a woman on a train platform who had recognized Victor Crow before she'd looked at anything else. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and moved through the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch, and the lamp on Silas Hawthorne's desk threw a long yellow square of light onto the dirt, and somewhere in the dark, something was just beginning to turn. He didn't sleep again that night. The telegram sat on his desk like a stone in a boot, small enough to ignore, too sharp to forget. Silas read it 4 more times before the lamp burned down enough that reading became an excuse rather than a purpose. And then he sat in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into itself the way old wood settles, groaning and shifting and never quite still. The initials at the bottom were E.W. He'd been slow about that. Slower than he should have been, maybe, but his mind had been running on too many tracks at once, and the obvious one had been the last to arrive. E.W. Eleanor Whitlock. The telegram had been sent from Chicago 6 days ago, which meant she had sent it before she boarded the train, before she'd even arrived. She'd sent him information about Victor Crow before she had any way of knowing whether Silas Hawthorne was a man who deserved it. That was either very trusting or very calculated, and he didn't know her well enough yet to know which. He thought about going to her room. He thought about knocking on that curtained doorway and asking her to explain herself right then at 11 o'clock at night. And he thought about how that would look and what it would accomplish, and he decided against it. Whatever Eleanor Whitlock was carrying, she'd been carrying it carefully, and a man who blundered into it in the middle of the night would get less truth than a man who waited and watched. Silas Hawthorne had spent 15 years learning to be patient about things he couldn't immediately fix. He waited. The morning came gray and cold the way October mornings came in Montana. Not apologetically, but with a kind of blunt authority that told you summer was done discussing it. Silas was up at 4:30, which was his habit, and he was surprised to find the kitchen lamp already lit when he came through. Eleanor was at the stove. She had on a different dress, dark gray this time, and her hair was already up, and she was doing 3 things simultaneously with the confidence of someone who had been doing 3 things simultaneously since before she could remember. Coffee on. Bacon laid out. Something in a pot that Silas couldn't identify yet, but that already smelled purposeful. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "Coffee's not ready." "I can wait." "Sit down then. You're taking up the room." He sat at the kitchen table, which was not a thing he normally did. He normally drank his coffee standing at the window, but something about the way she said it left no reasonable alternative. He sat and watched her work. She had an economy of motion that was either natural or learned, the kind where nothing was wasted, where one hand was always doing something while the other did something else, and the whole operation moved forward with a kind of quiet momentum. "You were up late," she said. Not accusatory, just observational. "Ranch business." "The telegram on your desk." He was quiet for a moment. "You could see my desk from the curtain." "I could see the lamp was still on at midnight." She turned and looked at him then, Direct, steady, no apology for the directness. I sent it before I left Chicago. I debated whether to tell you about it on the ride from the station, and I decided to let you find it first and decide whether to ask. That's a strange way to introduce yourself. The information in it is more useful than anything I could have said on a wagon. She turned back to the stove. Did you read it carefully? 4 times. Then you know that Victor Crow incorporated his cattle operation using capital from a land fraud scheme in Illinois. You know he has a silent partner in the Territorial Land Office here, and you know which land parcels he's been positioning to acquire. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him. What you don't know yet is why I know any of this. I was going to ask. I know you were. She sat down across from him with her own cup and put both hands around it and looked at him with that gray steadiness. How much did the agency tell you about me? Name, age, skill set? They said you'd been managing a boarding house in Chicago for 4 years. That's accurate as far as it goes. She took a breath, not a theatrical one, just the breath a person takes before saying something that costs something. Before the boarding house, I worked for a law firm on Michigan Avenue. Not as a lawyer, as a clerk, but a clerk who paid attention. How long? 7 years. Silas looked at her over his coffee. That's a long time to stop. I didn't stop voluntarily. Something moved through her face, old and controlled, like weather that's already passed but left marks. The senior partner decided that a woman of my, he said, social presentation was bad for the firm's image with certain clients. He let me go with a month's pay and a reference that was technically positive and practically useless. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you that for sympathy. I told you because you need to understand why I know things about Victor Crow that you don't. She wrapped both hands tighter around the cup. Crow was a client of that firm for 2 years before I was let go. I prepared his documents. I organized his correspondence. I read everything that crossed my desk, which was everything that crossed the senior partner's desk, which was everything. She paused. I also kept copies of certain things that I probably wasn't supposed to keep. The kitchen was very quiet. Why? Silas asked. Because I was good at my job, and part of being good at my job was understanding when something wasn't right. She met his eyes. Victor Crow's business documents didn't add up. The numbers were wrong in ways that a casual reader would never notice. I noticed. And instead of doing something about it then, I was a woman without a position and without a patron and without any meaningful recourse, she said, with a flatness that wasn't self-pity but was something harder. What exactly was I supposed to do with that information in Chicago in 1882? Write a letter to the police? Bring it to a judge? I would have been laughed out of every office in the city. She looked down at her coffee. So I kept it, and I waited. And when I saw the agency's advertisement in Hawthorne, Montana, and I recognized the county name from Crow's land acquisition documents, she stopped. You decided to come. I decided to come. Silas sat with that for a moment. The bacon was starting to smell done, and neither of them moved. So you came to finish something. I came because I needed to go somewhere, and this somewhere happened to also be useful. She stood up and went to the bacon before it burned. I'm not going to pretend it was entirely about you, Mr. Hawthorne. That would be insulting to both of us. He almost smiled at that. He caught it before it arrived, but it was close. The information in the telegram, he said. How much more do you have? Enough. She didn't turn around. Not enough for a court. Not yet. But enough to know what we're looking for and where to look. We, he said. She turned then. Unless you'd prefer to handle it another way. He thought about 15 months of watching Victor Crow dismantle his ranch piece by piece from a comfortable distance, smiling that particular smile, making comments in public that weren't quite accusable of anything. He thought about the telegram and the law firm, and a woman who had spent 7 years paying attention and then kept what she'd learned like a coal in her pocket, waiting for a time when she'd have somewhere to put the heat. No, Silas said. We is fine. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, and somewhere across the yard a horse made a complaint about the cold, and Iron Ridge Ranch began its day the way it always did, with more work than people to do it and more problems than solutions. But something in the kitchen that morning had shifted. Something had been laid on the table that couldn't be unlaid, and both of them knew it, and neither of them tried to pretend otherwise. Pete Garner noticed the change at breakfast. He noticed it in the particular way Pete noticed everything, quietly, from the side, filing it away without comment until the right moment. He watched Eleanor serve the morning meal with the same efficient authority she'd brought to supper the night before, and he watched the men eat with that focused gratitude that hungry men bring to good food. And he watched Silas at the end of the table with an expression Pete hadn't seen on him in probably 2 years. Not happy exactly, but present, like a man who had been somewhere else for a long time and had recently come back to his own face. What Pete also noticed, because Pete noticed everything, was Dale Greer. Greer was 3 seats down from Eleanor's end of the table, and he was eating her food with obvious pleasure while maintaining the expression of a man who refused to admit it was any good. He had a particular kind of pride, Dale Greer, the kind that needs constant feeding and turns ugly when it isn't fed. He'd been on the ranch 14 months, which was long enough to have developed opinions about the natural order of things, and short enough that those opinions hadn't been corrected yet. He waited until Eleanor had turned her back to refill the coffee pot. "You know what they say about a woman who can cook," Greer said, to no one in particular, at a volume calculated to be heard by the room. "Means she spent enough time in the kitchen to get good at it. Not much else to do when you can't catch a husband any other way." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of men eating, but the tight-braced kind that happens when something unpleasant has entered the room. Bobby, the young one, looked down at his plate. 2 other men found things to look at in their coffee. Pete Garner put down his fork. Eleanor turned around from the stove with the coffee pot in her hand, and her face was doing exactly nothing. Not anger, not embarrassment, nothing, in the way that nothing is sometimes the most alarming response available. She walked to Greer's end of the table. She refilled his cup without being asked. She did it with the same calm precision she brought to everything. Then she set the coffee pot down on the table beside his plate and looked at him directly. "Dale," she said, "when's the last time you had a meal that tasted like something?" He blinked. He hadn't expected the question. "What?" "Before last night, when's the last time you sat down to food that was worth eating?" He wanted to say something cutting. She could see it working in him, the little machinery of a man who communicates primarily through contempt. But the question had landed somewhere underneath that, in the part of him that had been eating salt pork and bad biscuits for the better part of a year. "I don't know," he said finally, which was probably more honest than he intended. "Then you're welcome," Eleanor said. She picked up the coffee pot. "And if you have more to say about my appearance, I'd recommend you say it to yourself, because the men in this room are going to be eating my cooking for as long as I'm here, and I'd hate for things to become uncomfortable at mealtimes." She went back to the stove. The table was extremely quiet. Then Bobby, 19 years old and possessing the kind of honesty that hasn't been fully socialized out of a person yet, said, "She's right, Dale," in a voice that was trying to be neutral and landing somewhere closer to judgment. 2 more men made small sounds of agreement. Not dramatic, just the quiet weight of a group of people realigning themselves. Dale Greer ate the rest of his breakfast without saying another word. Pete caught Silas's eye across the table, and Silas gave him the almost imperceptible nod that meant, "Yes, I saw it." And then, "Yes, I know." The morning work scattered the men across the property, and Eleanor got to know the kitchen the way she got to know everything, systematically, without sentimentality. She went through every cabinet and every shelf and every crate and made a list that was both practical and damning. The flour was old enough to have doubts about. The salt pork Pete had mentioned was exactly as bad as advertised. There were 3 kinds of dried beans and no clear plan for any of them. The stove itself had a fault on the left side that made it run hot, which explained why Cookie had been burning things even when he was sober. She found Cookie himself asleep in the small room off the kitchen that had apparently been his at some point. He was not a well man. Eleanor assessed him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, and reached the conclusion that he needed water, rest, and eventually a different situation, in roughly that order. She left a glass of water beside him and didn't wake him. By mid-morning, she had reorganized the kitchen storage, identified 3 repairs the room needed, and started a pot of beans going that would be ready by tomorrow. She had also, without anyone asking her to, noticed that the main house had drafts in 4 places, a rotting board on the porch that was going to put someone's foot through it, and a window latch in the front room that a determined child could open from outside. She wrote all of it down. She was not a woman who wrote things in her head and hoped she'd remember them. She'd spent 7 years in a law office learning that the difference between something recorded and something remembered was the difference between evidence and opinions didn't hold up. Silas found her list on his desk at noon, sitting under a small rock she'd used as a paperweight. He read through it twice. Then he read through the part at the bottom, written in a smaller, more compressed hand, which was not about the kitchen or the house, but about the pattern of cattle disappearances over the past 14 months, organized by date and location, and cross-referenced against what she'd learned from his side of the ledger she'd seen on the desk when she left the water glass in the list. She had been in this house for less than 20 hours. He stood in his office for a long moment with the list in his hand, and then he went to find her. She was on the porch with a hammer, addressing the rotten board. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Someone would have gone through it by winter. I have men for that. Your men are moving cattle." She hit the nail with a clean, practiced swing. Not tentative, she'd used a hammer before. "If you want, I can stop." He watched her for a moment. "The list, the bottom section." She looked up. "I wasn't going through your things. It was on the desk. I'm not accusing you." He leaned against the porch post. "The dates. How did you know the pattern?" 3 disappearances on nights with no moon, 2 more the week after you filed the water rights extension. She hit another nail. "It's not random. Someone is watching your schedule." He'd thought that. He hadn't been able to make it stick in his own mind because thinking it clearly meant accepting the scale of what he was dealing with. And there's a particular exhaustion that comes with problems that are bigger than your current capacity to solve them. "Greer," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, possibly. But Greer doesn't seem smart enough to be the source. He's been here 14 months, which means he arrived right around when the trouble started." She set the hammer down and looked at him. "But I'd be careful about deciding it's Greer specifically before you have something solid. If whoever is feeding information to Crow figures out you're suspicious, they'll stop making mistakes. So we watch and wait. We watch, and we find the paper." She picked the hammer back up. "There's always paper, Mr. Hawthorne. There is no transaction in the world that doesn't leave something behind." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the yard and lifted some dust off the ground in a small spiral and dropped it again. "You can call me Silas." She looked up at him. Something in her face shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but the opening of a door that had been respectfully closed. "All right," she said. "Silas." He went back inside. The problem with Victor Crow was not that he was powerful, though he was. The problem was not that he was ruthless, though he was that too. The problem, the central knotty problem that Silas had been wrestling with for over a year, was that Crow was patient. He didn't make dramatic moves. He made small ones, consistently, in the same direction, and individually none of them were quite enough to act on. The water rights dispute was a legal matter. The workers leaving was their right. The cattle going missing could have been weather, rustlers, any number of things. Each piece was plausible. Together they added up to something deliberate and systematic, but together was the part Silas couldn't prove. He thought about Eleanor's voice saying, "There's always paper." 3 days passed. The rhythm of the ranch reasserted itself around Eleanor like water finding new channels. She fed the men. She kept the kitchen in order. She managed Cookie's slow, difficult recovery from whatever he'd been using the bottle to avoid. And she did it with a firmness that wasn't unkind but wasn't patient either. She had no appetite for self-destruction when there was work to do, and she communicated this without ever making it personal. The hands, for their part, were recalibrating. Men in rough situations are practical about comfort in a way that can override a lot of other things. They had been eating badly for months. Now they were eating well. The logic of it was simple enough that even Dale Greer seemed to be doing the math, though he was doing it privately and with visible resentment. Bobby had started asking Eleanor questions about cooking, which she answered without commentary on the fact that a 19-year-old cowboy wanted to know how to make gravy. She just showed him. It was the least complicated transaction in the house. On the 4th day, Silas rode into Hartwell for supplies. He brought Pete. He left the list of kitchen supplies at the general store, and then he walked to the telegraph office and sent a message to a name Eleanor had given him. A territorial records clerk in Helena who could be persuaded to share information if approached with the right language. Eleanor had written out what to say. She had written it in 2 drafts, the second one considerably more precise than the first, and Silas had understood looking at it that she'd been composing this particular message in her head for a long time before she had someone to send it through. While he was at the telegraph office, Victor Crow walked in. This kept happening, Crow appearing in places that required him to be watching, which required him to either have very good instincts or very good information. Silas's money was on information. Silas, the easy smile, the silver-handled cane resting lightly on the floor. Sending word to someone? Ordering equipment. Silas folded the sent message receipt and put it in his breast pocket. You? Oh, business. Always business. Crow's eyes moved to the pocket just briefly. How is the new wife settling in? Fine. Quite an unusual choice. Crow said it conversationally, like a man admiring someone else's unconventional hat. I heard she's been making herself useful. That's what a wife does. Of course. A pause. Just long enough. Funny thing, I had a man who used to work at a law firm in Chicago. He mentioned the name Whitlock once, in passing. I could have sworn. He stopped, smiled. But no, that can't be right. Small world, though. Silas looked at him. Looked at him long enough that most men would have done something. Looked away, said something, shifted their weight. Crow just kept smiling. Have a good afternoon, Victor, Silas said. He walked out. He was on his horse and 3 blocks away before his hands stopped being quite so tight on the reins. He knows who she is. That was the thought, clear and cold. Maybe not everything, but something. He rode back to the ranch faster than was necessary and found Eleanor in the kitchen starting supper and told her what Crow had said, word for word, the way she'd told him to do with anything Crow said, because she'd told him on the second morning that exact wording mattered, that a man like Crow chose his words the way a careful man chose his footing on uncertain ground. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that the fire in the stove ticked 3 times. He knows my name, she said. He doesn't know what I have yet. You sure about that? If he knew what I had, we wouldn't be having this conversation, she said. He'd have moved against the ranch already. All of it, not the slow way. She turned to face him. He's guessing. He remembered the name and he's trying to see your face when he says it. My face didn't give him much. Good. She turned back to the stove. Then we still have time. Time for what exactly? She was quiet again, stirring something that didn't need stirring. I wrote to someone in Helena 2 weeks ago, before I left Chicago. Someone who keeps records of corporate filings for the territory. She paused. If they found what I think is there, they should be sending a response soon. Silas stared at the back of her head. You had this in motion before you arrived. I had pieces of it in motion. Eleanor. She stopped stirring. She didn't turn around. Yes. What exactly is between you and Victor Crow? The kitchen was very quiet. Something shifted in her shoulders. Not breaking, nothing like that, but the particular shift of a person setting down weight they've been carrying so long, they've forgotten it had a shape. He is, she said, my half-brother. The fire in the stove ticked 4 times. My mother was his father's second wife, Eleanor continued, her voice coming out measured and careful. Not legitimate, never legitimate in his family's view, but there was a small inheritance from my mother's side, her father's land and savings. When she died, it should have come to me. She stopped. Victor had a lawyer. I had nothing. By the time I understood what had happened, the money was gone and his name was on everything, and there was no version of the law in that city that was going to help me. Silas sat down at the kitchen table without intending to. He didn't know I'd kept copies of his documents, she said. He thought I was just a clerk in an office he used. He never looked at me long enough to understand what I was doing. The smallest, most controlled form of bitterness he had ever heard. Men like Victor rarely do. And now he's here. He came west 4 years ago, once the Illinois situation started getting complicated. Built himself a new empire with my family's money and other people's money and a great deal of patience. She finally turned. Her face was composed, but her eyes had something in them. Not grief, past grief, something harder. I'm not here to shoot him, Silas. I want you to understand that. I'm here because a bullet would make him a martyr and let the money disappear. I want the money found. I want the records exposed. I want him finished in a way that can't be undone. He looked at her for a long time. That's going to take time we might not have, he said. I know. If he figures out what you have, I know. He will move against the ranch, hard and fast, the way he hasn't so far. I know, Silas. Her voice was patient, but not soft. Which is why we need to be further along before he figures it out. She looked at him steadily. How much do you trust your men? Pete, completely. He thought about it. Bobby, reasonably. The others... He stopped at Greer's name. She nodded slowly, like she'd already been thinking the same thing. Then we're careful about what we say in front of the others. We. Yes, she said. We. He thought about the train platform and the laughter and Crow's voice doing its particular work. He thought about 15 months of slow, grinding loss and a ledger that added up to nothing. He thought about a telegram signed E.W. sitting on his desk in the dark. All right, he said. She turned back to the stove. Supper would be ready in an hour. Outside, the October dark was coming down fast over the mountains, and somewhere across the valley, Victor Crow was having his own supper and thinking his own thoughts. And the distance between what he knew and what he needed to know was getting smaller in ways that none of them could yet see clearly. But that night, after the men had eaten and the kitchen was quiet, and Silas had gone back to his desk and his ledger and his long habit of counting what he couldn't afford to lose, he found a second page behind the supply list he'd been working from. Eleanor's handwriting, smaller this time. A name, a bank in Helena, a date. And at the bottom, in the compressed, precise script of a woman who had spent 7 years learning that words on paper outlasted everything else. He moved the water rights filing to a proxy name. The proxy is registered at this bank. If the territorial records clerk sends what I asked for, we'll have the thread. Pull it carefully. Silas sat in the yellow lamplight and read it twice. Then he picked up his pen and wrote at the bottom of the page, in his own rough hand. I'll pull carefully. He left it on the desk where she'd find it in the morning. The ranch creaked and settled in the dark, and the wind came down off the mountains again, and Iron Ridge held on to itself with both hands the way it always had. And inside the house, two people who had each been fighting alone for a very long time were, without quite having decided to, beginning to fight together. The response from Helena arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Silas had sent the telegram. Pete brought it in from the road without comment, the way Pete handled most things that had weight to them, setting it on the kitchen table in front of Eleanor rather than on Silas's desk. Because somewhere in the past week and a half, Pete Garner had developed an accurate read on where the operational center of Iron Ridge Ranch actually was. Eleanor dried her hands on her apron and opened it standing up. She read it once, fast, the way you read something you've been waiting for. Then she read it again slowly. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and finished washing the bowl she'd been working on before Pete came through the door. Silas watched all of this from the doorway. Well, he said, the proxy account exists. She didn't look up from the bowl. The bank in Helena has records going back 3 years. The name on the account is Thomas Aldrin, which is a name I recognize from the Illinois filings. She set the bowl down. Thomas Aldrin doesn't exist. He's a construction. Victor has been using him for years. A paper man with a paper history who holds things that Victor doesn't want attached to his real name. Can we prove that? The clerk in Helena found a correspondence address for Aldrin that roots back to a post office box in Hartwell. She finally looked at him. Victor has been collecting mail as Thomas Aldrin 3 blocks from where he lives. Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was moving horses across the yard, and the sound of hooves on hard dirt came through the window in a steady rhythm. That's something. It's a thread, Eleanor said. It's not the whole cloth yet. But if we can get someone to the bank in Helena with the right documentation, the Illinois filings I have, cross-referenced with the Aldrin account records, we can show a pattern. She looked at her apron pocket where the letter was. A territorial judge could freeze the Aldrin assets pending investigation. That would cut off the money Crow has been using to pay the men he's hired against you. How long does something like that take? Weeks. If the judge is cooperative, she paused. If he isn't, longer. We don't have weeks of comfortable margin, Silas said. I know. If Crow figures out we're talking to Helena, I know, Silas. She turned to face him fully. I've been working this problem since before I boarded the train. I understand the timing. She wasn't sharp about it, but she was direct. What I need from you right now is to know whether there's anyone in the territorial administration you trust. Personally, not professionally. Personally. He thought about it, really thought, which was something Eleanor had noticed about him. When she asked him a question that mattered, he actually stopped and considered it, rather than producing the first answer that sounded reasonable. She'd come to rely on that quality without quite meaning to. Judge Harlan Cade, he said finally. We served together for about 8 months in '73. He's been in Helena 4 years. We're not close, but I trust his nature. Write to him today, Eleanor said. Personal letter, not through the telegraph office in town. Crow has someone at the telegraph office. Probably. Send Pete to Millbrook to post it. 20 miles is far enough that it won't come back to us before we're ready. Silas nodded slowly. You've been thinking about all of this? Yes. Since before you got here. Since before I got here, she confirmed. She went back to the dishes. Victor is going to move soon. I can feel it in the way he's been positioning. The comment at the telegraph office wasn't idle curiosity. He's verifying something. When a man like Victor starts verifying, it means he's almost ready. Ready for what? She was quiet for a moment. To stop being patient. That landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water, and the ripples of it were still moving when Bobby came in through the back door with mud on his boots and an expression on his young face that meant he'd seen something he didn't know what to do with. Mr. Hawthorne, he looked between them. There's 2 men on the North Ridge. Pete spotted them about an hour ago. They're not from around here. He'd know them if they were. They've been up there since morning. Silas and Eleanor exchanged exactly the kind of look that passes between people who have been thinking about the same problem from different angles and have just been handed a piece that fits both. Tell Pete to keep watch, but not approach, Silas said. Don't let Greer know. Bobby's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor, then back. He was young, but he was not entirely unobservant. Yes, sir. He left without tracking more mud than he'd already tracked. Eleanor set the last dish on the rack. How much does Pete Mumble know about what we're doing? Enough to be useful, not enough to be a liability. He knows Crow is behind the trouble. He doesn't know about the documents. She nodded. Keep it that way for now. If something goes wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong. If something goes wrong, she repeated, patient but firm. I need you to understand that the documents are in the lining of my winter traveling bag, the one under the cot. There's a seam on the left side that looks sewn but isn't. She met his eyes, in case I'm not the one who needs to use them. The kitchen felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Silas looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look too directly since the train platform, because something about looking at Eleanor Whitlock directly for too long had an unsettling effect on his self-possession. Nothing is going to go wrong, he said again, quieter. She almost smiled, not quite. Write the letter to Judge Cade. He wrote it that afternoon at his desk, with the door closed. 3 drafts before he had it, the way Eleanor said it needed to be. Factual, precise, personal in tone, but specific in content, enough to convey urgency without sounding like a man in a panic, which was approximately what he was. He gave it to Pete along with the travel money for Millbrook and watched Pete ride out at dusk without visible hurry, which was the right way to do it. Then he had 2 days of not knowing, which were the hardest kind. The men on the North Ridge were gone by the second morning. That didn't make Silas feel better. Men who disappear are just men who went somewhere else to do something, and the somewhere else was the part that concerned him. Dale Greer asked twice in those 2 days where Pete had gone. Silas told him Millbrook for supplies, which was true enough. Greer accepted it with a particular blankness that Silas had started reading differently since Eleanor's observation about the cattle timing. He didn't show that he was reading it differently. He had gotten, in 10 days, considerably better at keeping his face neutral around Greer than he'd been before, and he credited Eleanor for that without saying so. There was something about watching her operate, the economy of her reactions, that had rubbed off on him in a practical way. On the evening of the third day, a rider came from the direction of Crow's property. He wasn't one of Crow's men, or rather, he was, but he was dressed to look like he wasn't, which told its own story. He handed Silas an envelope at the porch steps and left at a pace that suggested he didn't want to be asked questions. The letter inside was from Victor Crow. Formal. Precise. It expressed Crow's concern about the ongoing water rights dispute and proposed a meeting at his property the following week to discuss what he called a mutually beneficial resolution. Silas read it standing on the porch in the last of the daylight and took it inside to Eleanor. She read it at the kitchen table while the beans for tomorrow were soaking and the stove was cooling from supper. She read it with the careful attention she gave to everything written, which was the attention of someone who understood that what wasn't said was usually more informative than what was. "He's not proposing a resolution," she said. "I know. He wants to see your face. He wants to see if you're scared." She set the letter down. "He's feeling pressure from somewhere, and he wants to know if it's coming from you." "What pressure?" "My letter to Helena. Even if he doesn't know specifically, the Aldrin account activity would be visible to someone paying close enough attention, and Victor pays attention." She tapped the letter with one finger. "Don't go. If I don't go, he'll take it as right back. Say you're interested in a resolution, but you'd prefer to meet in town, at the land office, with a county official present." She looked up at him. "He won't agree to that. But declining will cost him more than declining will cost you. It makes him look like the man who wanted a private meeting and refused the public one." Silas sat down across from her. The lamp between them made the shadows go long against the wall. "You think like a lawyer." "I worked for lawyers for 7 years. Something moved through her expression. "And I had 7 years to think about what I would have done differently if I'd had someone fighting on my side." That sat between them for a moment. "Eleanor." He said her name and then wasn't sure where he was going with it. She waited. He tried again. "What you told me. About your mother's inheritance. About what Crow did." "Yes. That's been with you a long time." 11 years, she said. "Since I was 24 and found out the money was gone." She looked at the lamp, not at him. "It's a strange thing to carry for a long time. You get used to the weight of it, and then you get so used to it that you stop noticing it's making you walk differently." He didn't know what to say to that, which was becoming a familiar condition around her. He was a man who had spent most of his adult life in a context where practical language was the only language anyone had patience for, and Eleanor kept arriving at things that were outside that vocabulary. "I'm going to make this right," he said. It came out rougher than he intended, less polished than the sentiment warranted. She looked at him then, directly, the way she looked at things she was deciding about. "You don't have to make anything right on my account. I'm not doing it on your account. I'm doing it because the man has been tearing down what I built for 15 years and I would like him to stop." He paused. "But also on your account." The lamp threw its unsteady light between them. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in that particular October way it had. Not cold enough yet to be cruel, but cold enough to remind you it was capable of it. Eleanor looked back at the letter. "Write the response. I'll help you with the wording." They worked on it together at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, his handwriting and her words, and both of them making changes until it said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. It was the most functional 40 minutes Silas could remember spending with another person in longer than he wanted to calculate. He sent the response with a ranch hand to Crow's property the next morning. By afternoon, the refusal came back. Crow had cited scheduling difficulties with a county official being present and suggested they meet privately instead. Eleanor read the refusal and said, "Good," which was exactly what she'd predicted, and she wasn't pleased with herself about it, just accurate. Pete came back from Millbrook on a Friday. He came back with the supplies and with a letter from Helena that he handed to Silas wordlessly at the gate. Silas took it to Eleanor. This had become the default operating procedure of Iron Ridge Ranch without anyone formally establishing it. Things of consequence went to Eleanor first, or simultaneously, and no one except possibly Greer had any objection to this, and Greer's objections had stopped being audible after the breakfast incident. The letter was from Judge Harlan Cade. Silas recognized the handwriting from 20 years ago, and something tightened in his chest in a way that was either hope or the thing that lives right next to hope and is afraid to call itself that. He read it first, then he gave it to Eleanor. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, and he watched her face while she did, which was a thing he'd started doing because her face during reading was more informative than most people's faces during conversation. When she finished, she set the letter down and put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the wall. "He'll see us," Silas said. "He'll see you," she corrected. "He said he'll see you. He'll see both of us." She turned. Cade said he's willing to review documentation for a potential federal fraud case if the evidence is as described. That's more than I expected. Something in her voice shifted, some small thing, not much, but he caught it. "I thought it would take longer. Cade's a practical man. He trusted your word. He trusted 15 years of knowing me." Silas looked at her. "When do we go?" "Not together. Not obviously." She thought for a moment. "You should go first. Take the financial records from the ledger, your own documented losses, the water rights filing dates, everything that shows the pattern of interference. I'll send the Illinois documents separately, through a channel Crow can't monitor." She paused. "And we need to move before Victor does something that changes the situation on the ground." The situation on the ground changed the next morning, before they were ready for it. Silas was at the north fence line with Bobby when he heard the sound. Not a clear sound, more like a quality of wrongness in the air. And then Pete's voice carrying across the field with an urgency it never normally had. He rode back fast. There were 3 men in the yard he didn't know. They were sitting their horses without any apparent concern about being on private property, and the way they were sitting, loose-limbed and deliberate, the posture of men paid to be present and unbothered, told him everything about who'd sent them. Dale Greer was in the yard too, and the angle between him and the 3 strangers was slightly too natural, slightly too comfortable, the angle of people who had some previous arrangement about being in the same place. Eleanor was on the porch. She was standing very still, her hands at her sides, and she was watching Dale Greer with the expression she reserved for things she was deciding what to do about. Silas came in at a canter and stopped and looked at the 3 men. "Can I help you?" The one in the middle, older, with a beard that had been better managed at some previous point in his life, reached into his coat and produced a document. "Delivering notice from the Hartwell County Water Authority. The water access on the North Creek of this property is under disputed status pending review. You're notified not to divert, dam, or otherwise direct said water source until review is complete." Silas didn't take the document. "That creek has been on Iron Ridge land for 15 years. "Yes, sir. Disputed status, as I said." "Who filed the dispute?" The man's face was entirely neutral in the way of people paid for neutrality. "The filing party is listed in the document." "Whose name is on it?" "Thomas Aldrin, sir." "On behalf of—" "Thomas Aldrin." Silas said the name flat and quiet. Behind him, he heard Pete make a small sound. "On behalf of the Crow-Aldrin Land and Cattle Partnership," the man finished, without any visible awareness of what he'd just handed over. Silence. The kind that has actual texture to it. Silas took the document. He didn't look at it. He looked at Dale Greer, who was looking at the ground with the specific intentness of a man who very much wanted to not be looked at right now. "Get off my property," Silas said to the 3 men. "Level. No heat in it, just fact." They left. Dale Greer started to move toward the bunkhouse, and Pete Garner stepped in front of him, not threateningly, just occupying the space. "Silas," Pete said. "Not an alarm, a notification." Greer stopped. He looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has been caught and is calculating options. There weren't many options, and they both knew it. "How long?" Silas said. Greer's jaw worked. "I don't know what you—" "How long have you been reporting to Crow?" The yard was very still. Bobby was somewhere behind Silas, young enough that this was probably the most serious thing he'd been present for, and experienced enough to stay quiet. Greer looked at the ground, Then at the porch, where Eleanor was still standing, something moved through his face. Not remorse exactly, but the specific discomfort of a man whose contempt for someone has been complicated by circumstances. 8 months, he said. 8 months. Right around the time the cattle losses had started accelerating. What did he pay you? Enough. Was it enough? Silas asked. The quietness of his own voice surprised him. He'd expected to be angrier. Instead, he mostly felt tired in the particular way of things that are confirmed rather than surprising. Take your gear and go. Now? Before noon. Greer looked like he was considering saying something more, and then he looked at Pete Garner's face and reconsidered. He went to the bunkhouse. Bobby let out a long breath. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. I bunked with him for Bobby. Silas turned. It's not on you. It never is, with men like that. Bobby nodded, working to accept that, young enough that it was still work. Silas walked to the porch. Eleanor stepped back to let him through the door, and he went inside into his desk and sat down and put the Water Authority document on the desk and looked at it. She followed him, stood in the doorway. Crow-Aldrin Land and Cattle Partnership, he said. He used the Aldrin name in a legal filing. Yes. Filed in the county, which means there's a record, a public record. Yes. Something in Eleanor's voice had changed. A tightening, a focus, the particular quality of attention that meant she was moving fast inside. He made a mistake. Did he know he was making one? I don't think so. I think he's been using Aldrin for so long that it's become automatic. He may not even fully register it as a risk anymore. She came into the room and stood at the desk. This document connects Aldrin's name to Crow's name in a legal filing with the county. That's the link I didn't have the paper for before. She looked at him. Silas, we need to go to Helena. Not next week. Now. Now. As soon as we can ride, both of us. She held up a hand before he could object. I know what you're going to say about leaving the ranch. Pete can hold it. She stopped. Yes. For a few days he can hold it. He looked at the document again. We need everything you have. All of it. I'll get it. She went. He heard her in the room down the hall, the sounds of careful, deliberate movement, and he thought about a bag with a false seam in the lining and documents that had been carried across 2,000 miles in 11 years and a train platform full of laughter, and he thought, we are closer than we were this morning. He also thought, Crow is going to figure out what happened with Greer, and when he does. He didn't finish that thought. He didn't need to. He went to find Pete. Pete was in the yard where Greer had been, looking at the dust like it owed him something. I'm taking Eleanor to Helena, Silas said. Day after tomorrow at the earliest. Possibly tomorrow if we can have things ready. Pete looked at him. For how long? 3 days? Maybe 4? What am I watching for while you're gone? Everything. He paused. Crow is going to figure out soon that Greer is gone and that the water filing didn't have the effect he wanted. When he does, he may try to move physically against the ranch, not just paperwork. Pete absorbed this with the stillness of a man who'd been in worse situations and survived them on nerve and patience. How many men should I trust? Bobby. The Alcott brothers. They've been here 3 years and they've never given me a reason. Keep Marcus and Eddie close. Don't tell them specifics. Silas met his eyes. If anyone from Crow's operation comes on this property, you do not engage. You send word to the county sheriff and you wait. And if the county sheriff is in Crow's pocket? Silas was quiet for a moment. Send word to Sheriff Dunmore in Millbrook. He isn't. He thought about Judge Cade's letter, the careful and precise language of a man who had decided something. And things may be moving in Helena faster than we expected. Pete looked at him for a long time. Pete had known Silas for 9 years and had the rare quality of trust that doesn't require explanation. All right, he said. Go. That evening, Eleanor laid the documents on the kitchen table. Silas had seen the telegram from Chicago and the letter from Helena and the Water Authority filing. He had not seen what came out of the lining of the traveling bag. It was more than he'd expected, 11 years of careful, patient accumulation. Corporate filings with numbers she'd annotated in the margins in a small, precise hand. Correspondence, not original letters, but copies made in the same small hand, transcribed verbatim with dates and senders noted. Bank transfer records. Land acquisition documents from Illinois that showed the money trail from her mother's estate into accounts that became Crow's operating capital. A handwritten timeline on 3 pages that organized it all in the way a lawyer would organize a case. Chronological, cross-referenced, with sources noted for each claim. Silas looked at all of it spread across the table and felt something he wasn't entirely prepared for. "Eleanor," he said. She was organizing it into the order she wanted to present it. "I know it's a lot. You've been building this for 11 years. Yes, by yourself." She stopped arranging. She looked up. There wasn't anyone else. He looked at her across the documents. Across 11 years of careful, solitary work. Across 2,000 miles. Across a train platform and a kitchen, and 10 days of learning each other in the way you learn someone when there's no room for the false version. He looked at her and thought about the word alone in all the forms it had, and thought that Eleanor Whitlock knew every single one of them. "There is now," he said. It was not a romantic statement. It was a practical one, which was the only kind he was built for, and somehow that made it land more solidly than anything Flowery could have. She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to organizing the documents. "We should sleep," she said. "It's a long ride." He started helping her arrange the papers. "Tell me the order you want them in." She told him. He organized. The lamp burned between them while the ranch quieted into night outside, and the documents took their shape on the table. 11 years of evidence, finally in the hands of 2 people instead of 1, finally moving toward the use they had always been meant for. In Victor Crow's house across the valley, a lamp would be burning too. Silas thought about that. Thought about the particular kind of patience that was about to run out on both sides of this. The morning would come early. They had a long way to go and not much time to get there before Victor Crow looked at the Water Authority filing and understood what he'd accidentally written into the public record with his own name. The table was ready, the bag was packed. Eleanor put her hand flat on the stack of documents the way you put your hand on something you've been waiting to give to the right moment. The right moment was almost here. They left before dawn. Not secretly. There was no real way to leave a working ranch secretly, and trying would have drawn more attention than writing out openly at first light. But quietly, with purpose. The way people leave when they understand that what they're riding toward matters more than what they're leaving behind. Eleanor had the documents in a leather satchel that Silas had produced from somewhere in the back of his office. Old, well-made, the kind of bag that had been built to last and had done exactly that. She'd repacked everything the night before in the order she wanted, with the Illinois filings at the front and the annotated timeline at the back and the Water Authority document with Crow Aldrin's name on it, sitting right in the middle where a judge's eye would fall on it naturally. Pete stood at the gate as they rode out. He didn't say much. He gave Silas a look that contained everything 2 men who'd worked together for 9 years could communicate without words, and Silas gave back a look that said, "I know, and hold it together until I get back." Bobby was at the fence post behind Pete, and he raised his hand in a small wave at Eleanor that she returned with a nod, and that was the whole of the farewell. The road to Helena was 2 days on horseback if you pushed it, and 3 if you didn't. They pushed it. The first hours were quiet in the way that early morning travel is quiet. The world not fully committed to the day yet, the light coming up slow and gray across the flat land before the mountains, the horses finding their rhythm on the hard-packed road. Silas rode slightly ahead out of habit, then corrected himself and pulled back even. Eleanor rode competently. He'd wondered, and now he knew. She wasn't a frontier woman. You could tell she'd learned riding somewhere that had proper instruction in level ground. But she was steady, and she didn't complain about pace or cold, and that was what the next 2 days required. They stopped at mid-morning to water the horses at a creek. Eleanor got down without help and walked to the water's edge and stood there for a moment looking at the mountains in the distance. "Victor will know Greer is gone by now," she said. "Yes." "He'll guess why." "Not necessarily. Greer could have left for any reason." Silas watered his horse beside hers. though Crow doesn't usually believe in coincidence. No. She was quiet for a moment. He'll start watching the roads. We're not the only people who travel to Helena. He'll watch anyway. She looked at him. If someone stops us, if one of his men is on this road— The documents are legal property, Silas said. They're not contraband. He can't take them from you. He could try. He could try, Silas agreed. He said it without bravado, just as a fact that existed alongside other facts. Then we'd have a different kind of problem. Eleanor turned back to the mountains. I've been thinking about what I want to say to Judge Cade. I'd planned to do the talking. She looked at him sideways. Or not, he said. You should do the initial introduction. He knows you. That matters. A judge's first impression of a case is usually set in the first 3 minutes, and the first 3 minutes should come from someone he trusts. She bent and cupped water in her hand and washed her face with it, completely matter-of-fact about the cold. Then I'll lay out the documents. The sequence matters. I want him to see the Illinois history first before he sees the territorial filings, so that when he gets to the Aldrin-Crow connection, he already understands the pattern he's looking at. You've done this before, Silas said. I've prepared for it for 11 years. No. The actual presenting, to someone with authority. She paused. I prepared documents for court filings. I organized evidence for depositions. I was never in the room when it mattered. Something in her voice. Not bitter exactly, but the residue of old frustration. That was the part I was never allowed to do. Silas thought about that. You're in the room now. She looked at him again. That direct, measuring look she had that he'd stopped finding disconcerting and started finding steadying somewhere around day 4 of her being at Iron Ridge. Yes, she said. I am. They rode on. The country changed as they moved north. The flat range giving way to longer grades, the road narrowing and then widening again at creek crossings, the mountains coming clearer as the day came clearer. They stopped for a quick midday meal of what Eleanor had packed that morning. Bread, dried meat, the kind of food designed for function rather than pleasure. She ate without commenting on it, which was a thing Silas had noticed about her. She never complained about conditions that couldn't be immediately changed. He'd been thinking, on and off since they left, about what she'd said the night she'd told him about Crow. 11 years, since she was 24. He did the math and arrived at 35, which was her age now, and thought about what it meant to be 24 and have everything your mother left you taken away by a man with better lawyers and less conscience, and then spend the next 11 years building the case to undo it while simultaneously managing to survive, and then get on a train to Montana and walk into a situation that most women would have turned around and left on the first morning. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. When you were at the law firm, the 7 years, did they know what they had? She took a moment with that question. What do you mean? The lawyers. Did they understand what kind of mind they were working with? She looked at the road ahead. One of them did, she said after a moment. Mr. Hollis. He was the junior partner, the younger one. He used to ask my opinion on document sequencing, on how to present evidence, on whether a particular argument had a logical gap in it. A pause. He left the firm in my 5th year to start his own practice. After that, it was just the senior partner, and he thought of me primarily as someone who filed things accurately and made acceptable coffee. That's a waste. Yes, she said simply. It was. They came to a town called Redfield at late afternoon. Small, functional, the kind of settlement that exists because a road needs a stopping point. There was a boarding house that advertised itself with a hand-painted sign that had been rained on enough times to be half suggestion. Silas secured 2 rooms, which Eleanor had expected him to do, and was privately relieved about, because the question of what a married couple traveling together does about sleeping arrangements was one she hadn't fully worked out her feelings on, and didn't have the available mental space to work out right now. The rooms were small and cold and adequate. She didn't say so to Silas, but adequate was a significant improvement over some of the places she'd slept in the 2 years after losing her job and before the boarding house had become available. She sat on the cot with the satchel in her lap and went through the documents one more time. Not because she didn't have them memorized, she had for years, but because the physical act of going through them settled something in her. made it real in a way that the inside of her own head couldn't always guarantee. The knock on the door was Silas. "There's something to eat downstairs if you want it. Give me 10 minutes. He gave her 10 minutes. She came down to find him at a corner table with 2 plates of something that might have been stew in a previous version of itself, and bread that was 3 days past its best. She sat and ate it without comment. Silas ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had eaten bad food in frontier towns for 20 years and had no strong feelings about it either way. "Cade's letter," Silas said. "He said he could see us Friday. Today's Wednesday. We'll be there by tomorrow evening if the road stays clear." He looked at her. "That gives you 1 night to think about anything you want to add." "I've had 11 years to think about what I want to add," she said. "I know. I mean about us, about the ranch." He seemed slightly uncomfortable with what he was about to say, the way he got when things moved from the practical into the personal. "Cade is going to ask how I know what I know. He's going to want to understand how a ranch owner in Hartwell got his hands on corporate filings from Illinois. You tell him through your wife. He'll have questions about that. Then I'll answer them." She looked at him. "Silas, I know this puts you in an unusual position, arriving at a federal judge's office with a wife you've had for 2 weeks who turns out to have a personal history with the man you're filing against. I don't care about the unusual position. It could affect how he receives Eleanor." He said her name with a firmness that wasn't frustration, just emphasis. "I read what's in that satchel. I know what it says, and I know what it means. Cade is a practical man who cares about evidence. The evidence is what it is regardless of who carried it." He picked up his coffee, which was bad, and drank it anyway. "I'm not worried about how it looks. I'm worried about whether it's going to be enough." She was quiet for a moment. "It should be enough to freeze the Aldrin accounts and issue a warrant for examination of Crow's financial records. Whether it's enough to convict—" She stopped. "That's not our job. Our job is to get it in front of someone who can act and let the process do what it's supposed to do. And if the process moves slower than Crow does?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it the way you think about a tooth that needs pulling. You know it's coming, you know it's going to hurt, and there's no version of it that's comfortable. Then Pete holds the ranch, and you ride back, and I keep pushing in Helena until something moves. She met his eyes. "I'm not fragile, Silas. I can stay in Helena alone and work on this." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not what I want. What you want and what the situation requires might be different things. I know that." He set down the coffee. "I'm just telling you what I want." Something about that landed differently than she expected. She looked back at her plate. "Let's get to Helena first and see what Cade says." He agreed, which was the practical response. And they both knew it was also the response that set aside what neither of them quite knew how to say at a table in a bad boarding house in Redfield, Montana, on a Wednesday night when the situation required all available attention elsewhere. She slept better than she'd expected to. The second day of riding was harder. The road had been soft with overnight rain, and the horses moved with less certainty, and the sky was doing the particular thing October skies did in this country where they couldn't quite decide between threat and delivery. Eleanor's back ached in the way that a day and a half of riding produces in someone who doesn't ride regularly, but she adjusted her posture and didn't mention it, and Silas either didn't notice or understood that noticing would not be welcome. They came into Helena in the early evening when the city was doing its settling in, lamps going up in windows, the particular sound of a territorial capital at the end of a working day, more substantial than Hartwell in the way that a place with a government presence is more substantial than a place without one. Silas found a hotel that was decent without being expensive, which was the right calibration given that he didn't know how many days this was going to take. Eleanor unpacked only what she needed for the night and kept the satchel close. At 7 o'clock, there was a knock on her door that she knew was Silas before she opened it, and she was right. "I sent word to Cade that we're here," he said. "He moved the meeting to tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. "Good." She stepped back. "Come in. I want to go through the presentation order one more time." He came in and sat in the chair by the window and listened while she walked through it standing, the documents spread on the bed, her voice steady and organized, the way she would present it to Cade. He listened with the quality of attention she'd come to rely on. Real attention, Not the perform kind, the kind that occasionally asked a question that improved what it was asking about. The timeline, he said at one point. The 3-page one. Where does that go? End of the Illinois section, before the territorial filings. Put it first. She looked at him. Cade is practical, Silas said. He thinks in chronological order. If you show him the shape of the whole thing before the details, he'll follow the details better. She thought about it. He was right. It was the same instinct Mr. Hollis had had, that junior partner who'd left, the understanding that a story has to be told in the right order or the evidence in it becomes noise. All right, she said, timeline first. He nodded. You've never done anything like this before, she said. No. But you know how to listen to what's wrong. He seemed slightly thrown by that. I grew up with a father who talked too much and a mother who didn't talk enough. I learned to listen to the space between. She looked at him across the documents. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his hat on the chair arm beside him, the lamplight doing what lamplight does to a face that's had weather in it, finding the angles and the history and the particular lived-in quality that younger faces don't have. He wasn't a comfortable man. He wasn't easy. But he was present in a way that she had needed without knowing she'd needed it, and that was a thing she filed carefully and didn't examine too closely because they had work to do tomorrow and she couldn't afford to be anything other than clear-headed. Sleep, she said. 8 o'clock comes early. He stood, collected his hat, and paused at the door. Eleanor. Yes. Whatever happens tomorrow. He stopped, started again. You did good work, the 11 years. It's good work. She didn't have a response to that wouldn't require more of her than she had available right now, so she said, Good night, Silas. And he said good night and left. She sat with the documents for another hour before she put them away. Judge Harlan Cade was a broad, gray-haired man with the face of someone who had spent 3 decades being professionally skeptical about most things. His office in the territorial building was exactly what an office belonging to a man like that looked like. Functional, organized, no concessions to impression management. He had a clerk who showed them in at 8 o'clock exactly, and then left and closed the door. He shook Silas's hand with the warmth of actual recognition. Not performed, not political, the kind that comes from having been through something difficult with someone and having both come out the other side. He looked at Eleanor with assessment that was not unkind, but was thorough. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, Judge Cade. She sat without waiting to be invited to sit, which was a small thing that established something she needed established. Silas sat beside her. Cade looked between them. Your letter described a complex situation. It is complex, Silas said, but the evidence isn't. The evidence is straightforward. Show me. Eleanor opened the satchel. She started with the timeline as Silas had suggested, and she watched Cade's eyes as she talked through it. The estate, the Illinois fraud, the construction of the Aldrin identity, the movement of capital westward. She used the voice she'd developed in 7 years of preparing other people's arguments. Clear, precise, without emotional inflection, because emotional inflection invited dismissal, and she was not about to be dismissed. Not here, not now. Cade looked at the documents as she produced them. He asked questions. Good questions. The kind that showed he was following the logic rather than just being polite. When she got to the Crow-Aldrin Water Authority filing from Hartwell County, she set it on the desk in front of him and let him read it without narration. He read it twice. This is a county document, he said. Filed 8 days ago, Eleanor said. Public record. Victor Crow's name and Thomas Aldrin's name in the same legal filing, establishing a partnership. And Thomas Aldrin is a constructed identity. The correspondence address for Aldrin in Hartwell routes to a post office box that we can demonstrate Crow has been using. The bank account in Helena associated with Aldrin was opened with capital that I can trace, through the Illinois records, back to my mother's estate. She paused. The same estate that Victor Crow inherited through a fraudulent legal process in 1875. Cade looked at her. You have documentation of the Illinois process? Copies. My own copies, made during the time I worked at the law firm that handled Crow's affairs. The originals would be in the Cook County Courthouse records. She met his eyes. I would not walk into this room with copies as my only documentation if I were not certain the originals exist and are consistent with what I have here. Cade was quiet for a moment. The room was very still, the kind of stillness that happens when something important is being decided. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said finally, "how long have you been building this?" 11 years, she said, "and you came to Montana." My husband's ranch was being destroyed by the same man who took my family's money. It seemed an efficient use of my time to address both problems simultaneously. Something that might have been respect moved through Cade's face, there and gone quickly. He looked at Silas. "You understand what she's proposing?" "I understand," Silas said. "Freeze the Aldrin accounts. Issue federal examination warrants for Crow's financial records, and you'll find enough to prosecute. If the Illinois records are consistent with what she has here." "They will be," Eleanor said. "That's a significant assertion." "Judge Cade." She leaned forward slightly. "I spent 7 years in a law office. I have understood for a very long time that the difference between what I know and what a court can use is documentation. Every document I have produced for you today, I produced because I understood that it would need to hold up in exactly this kind of room." She paused. "I have been in that room in my head for 11 years. I know what it requires." Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the document spread across his desk. Then he looked at Silas. "Your assessment of her," he said. "Just that." Silas looked at Eleanor. Not at the documents, not at the desk, at her. "She's the most capable person I've encountered in 41 years, he said, "and I spent 15 of those years building something from nothing in rough country, so I know capable when I see it." Eleanor kept her face still. She was not going to respond to that in a judge's office. She would respond to it later, in some private moment, in whatever way made sense when there wasn't a federal warrant in the balance. Cade picked up the Water Authority document again. He looked at it for a long moment in the way of a man making a final calculation. "I need 48 hours, he said. "I want my clerk to verify the Helena bank account information, and I want a telegraph sent to the Cook County Courthouse to confirm the Illinois records exist." He set the document down. "If both of those come back consistent with what you've presented, I can issue a preliminary examination warrant and a motion to freeze the Aldrin accounts." "And Crow?" Silas asked. "If the warrant issues, the U.S. Marshal's office here will serve it. Crow will be notified that his financial affairs are under federal examination." Cade's voice was even and precise. "At that point, any action he takes against your property becomes federal obstruction, which is a significantly different situation than a county water dispute." "He won't wait to be notified," Eleanor said. Cade looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Victor will hear that we came to Helena. He has ways of knowing things." She glanced at Silas. "He'll move against the ranch before the warrant arrives. He'll try to force a conclusion before the legal situation changes." Cade was quiet. "Then get back," he said to Silas. "I'll move as fast as I can on my end. You need to hold the ranch until the marshals can serve the warrant." Silas stood. "How fast is fast?" 36 hours, Cade said. "If everything lines up, possibly less." Eleanor gathered the documents with careful, steady hands. She left copies with Cade, so she had made 2 sets because of course she had made 2 sets, and kept the originals in the satchel. She stood and offered her hand to Cade, who shook it with more gravity than he'd shown at the beginning of the meeting. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "this is thorough work." "Thank you, Judge." They walked out of the territorial building into the thin Helena morning, and Silas put on his hat against the wind, and they stood on the steps for a moment with the city around them and the thing they'd just done sitting between them like something that had changed the weather. "We need to ride," Silas said. "I know. Now. Not tomorrow." "I know, Silas." He looked at her. The wind was doing something to her hair that she was ignoring. "Can you ride through the night if we have to?" She thought about her back, which was still protesting the previous 2 days. "Yes," she said. They went back to the hotel and were gone within the hour. The road south was harder in a way that had nothing to do with conditions. It was the knowledge of what was behind them and what was ahead of them, and the gap between the two that had to be covered in time they weren't sure they had. Silas rode with a directness that was different from the ride out. Less careful, more committed. Eleanor matched his pace without being asked to. They were 2 hours out of Helena when she saw the rider on the hill. She almost didn't say anything because she wasn't certain, and certainty mattered. But then the rider moved in a way that casual riders don't move, purposeful, watching, and she said, "Silas." He'd already seen it. "Don't change pace," he said. "I know." They rode at the same speed for the next mile, and the rider on the hill paralleled them and then dropped below the ridgeline and was gone. "Crow has a man on this road," Eleanor said. "He has a man watching this road," Silas said. "Watching is different from stopping. He'll send word ahead." "Yes." "Then we're running out of time." Silas looked at the road ahead, the long, hard miles between here and Hartwell, between what they'd set in motion in Helena and what was waiting at Iron Ridge. He thought about Pete and Bobby and the Alcott brothers and the ranch that had taken 15 years of his life to build and had been coming apart for the past 15 months. He pushed the horse to a harder pace. Eleanor pushed hers to match. The miles went under them with the particular urgency of people who understood that somewhere behind them a clock was running, and somewhere ahead the thing they'd been building toward was about to be tested in a way that documents and judges and careful strategies couldn't entirely control. 36 hours, Kate had said. They needed the ranch to still be standing when those 36 hours were done. Silas thought about Pete's face at the gate that morning, the steady, quiet face of a man who had been trusted with something. And he thought, "Hold it, Pete. Whatever comes, just hold it." The road was long and the light was getting flat, and they rode without stopping, and Iron Ridge was still 2 days away, and somewhere in the valley ahead of them, Victor Crow was making calculations of his own. They rode through the night, not the whole night. The horses couldn't sustain that, and neither could the riders. But they stopped only twice, briefly, at water, and they kept moving through the dark hours with the kind of determination that isn't heroic so much as necessary. Eleanor didn't complain. Silas didn't ask her if she needed to stop. They had arrived, somewhere in the long miles between Helena and home, at the kind of understanding that doesn't require words, that the situation had moved past the point where comfort was a relevant consideration. She thought about Pete, somewhere in the dark ahead of them, holding a ranch with 4 loyal men against whatever Victor had decided to send. She thought about Bobby, 19 years old and honest, who had said I didn't know about Greer with such genuine distress that she'd wanted to tell him that good people are always the last to see it coming, which is not a flaw but a consequence of being good. She thought about the rider on the hill outside Helena and what he'd gone to report, and how many hours head start that report had given Crow. Too many. Probably too many. But probably was not certainly, and certainly was the only thing that would make her stop riding. They came into Hartwell's outskirts at dawn of the second day, stiff and unwashed and running on the particular fuel that is equal parts urgency and stubbornness. The town was just waking, smoke from chimneys, a dog crossing the main street without particular purpose, the general store's owner unlocking his front door and looking at them as they rode past with the expression of a man filing away something he intended to discuss later. Silas didn't stop in town. He pushed straight through toward the ranch road. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. Not gunfire, not yet, but the particular quality of tension that a group of men in a standoff produce, a kind of loaded silence that has sound in it if you know how to listen. They came over the last rise before the ranch, and she saw it laid out below, like a problem she'd been warned about and still wasn't prepared for. 6 men on horseback at the entrance to the North Creek Road. Crow's men, by their arrangement and their stillness, the practiced positioning of people placed rather than gathered. Pete and the Alcott brothers were on the near side of the fence line, on foot, and the geometry of the situation was clear. Crow's men had moved to block the water access, which was the thing the county notice had been warning toward, and they'd done it before dawn when the ranch was least prepared. Pete saw Silas coming down the rise, and something in his posture changed. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. Silas had come back, which was good. Silas had come back to a situation that had gotten worse while he was gone, which was the other part. Silas pulled up at the fence line and looked at the 6 men across the creek. He knew 2 of them. The others were the kind of hired presence that Victor Crow could afford. Not local, not invested, just professional about being an obstacle. "Pete," he said, How long have they been there? Since before first light. Pete's voice was level but tight underneath. They served a copy of that water authority notice and then just stayed. He paused. Victor Crow is behind them. Up the creek road about a quarter mile. He rode out personal this time. Eleanor heard that and felt something go cold and precise in the center of her chest. Victor had come himself. That meant he'd decided something was ending today, one way or another, and he'd wanted to be present for the ending. She knew that quality in him. She'd seen it once before, when he was 26 and she was a girl of 13 watching him sit across a lawyer's desk with the same comfortable certainty, the certainty of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply allowing the formalities to conclude. "Silas," she said quietly. He turned. "Don't engage with the men at the fence." She kept her voice low. "That's what he wants. A confrontation here that becomes a legal matter in this county, in front of officials he has influence with." She looked at him steadily. "How far out are the marshals?" 36 hours from when Cade said he'd move. We left Helena yesterday morning." Silas did the math, and she watched him do it, watched the calculation arrive at the same place hers had. "Could be any time, could be hours still." "Then we need to hold this without shooting anyone." "I know that. And we need Victor to stay here. If he leaves before the marshals arrive." She stopped. "He has money outside of Aldrin. Not much, but enough to run on. If he gets to the border before the warrant serves..." "He won't run," Silas said. "He doesn't think he needs to." She looked at the men blocking the creek road, and beyond them at the quarter-mile distance where Victor Crow was sitting his horse in the early morning light, and she thought, Silas is right. Victor doesn't think he needs to run. Victor thinks he's already won, which is the most dangerous version of Victor there is. "I'm going to talk to him," she said. Silas turned sharply. "No." "Not at the fence. Not in front of his men." She was already thinking through it, the way she'd learned to think through legal situations. Find the thing that creates delay without triggering escalation. "Victor and I haven't spoken in 11 years. He won't be able to resist it. He'll want to explain himself, or gloat, or it doesn't matter which. What matters is that while he's talking to me, he's not moving. Eleanor, he won't hurt me in front of witnesses," she said. "Victor is many things, but he's not stupid about optics." Pete was listening to this exchange with the careful attention of a man deciding whether to object, and concluding that the woman who had been running this ranch's operations for 2 weeks probably had better instincts about this specific situation than he did. He said nothing. Silas said, "I'll come with you." "No, you stay here and you keep your men calm, and you do not under any circumstances give Crow's people a reason to draw a weapon." She looked at him with a directness she hoped communicated everything she didn't have time to say gracefully. "Trust me." He held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that Pete looked at the fence post. "Come back to this side of the fence inside 20 minutes, Silas said. "If you're not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming after you and the situation gets considerably less controlled." 20 minutes, she agreed. She dismounted and handed her horse's reins to Bobby, who had appeared at her elbow with the instinct of a young man who has decided to be useful regardless of whether anyone asked him to be. She straightened her coat and picked up the satchel. She hadn't left it on the horse, hadn't left it anywhere since Helena, and she wasn't going to start now. And she walked to the fence gate and through it and up the creek road without looking back. The 6 men watched her pass. She didn't acknowledge them. There was a particular kind of power in moving through a situation as though the obstacles in it are simply not relevant to your direction, and she had learned it in 7 years of walking through rooms that didn't expect her to have authority and had gotten it anyway. She heard hooves on the road ahead, and Victor Crow came around the bend at a walk because he'd been told she was coming, or he'd seen her from where he waited. Either way, he'd come to meet her, which was what she'd counted on. He looked exactly like himself. That was the first thing she thought, which was a strange thought, but 11 years is a long time to carry a face in your memory and then have it confirmed. The silver-handled cane across his saddle, the coat, the ease that wasn't ease but was control-wearing ease's clothing. He was 47 now, and it showed, but it showed in the way that power ages, hardening things rather than softening them. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her and looked down at her with an expression she'd also carried for 11 years. Eleanor, he said, like finding a coin he'd dropped. Victor, you look well. He said it with the particular brand of insincerity that is actually a form of aggression. I'm not here to discuss how I look, she said. I'm here because we haven't spoken in 11 years and I thought you deserved to hear it from me directly. Something moved in his face. Curiosity, tamped down behind the performance of composure. Hear what? That it's done. She held the satchel's strap. I met with Judge Harlan Cade and Helena 2 days ago. I presented documentation connecting the Aldrin accounts to the Illinois estate fraud. The water authority filing you made last week, the one with both your name and Aldrin's name on it, was the last piece. She paused. You made it very easy at the end. I want you to know that. His face changed. Not dramatically. Victor didn't do dramatic. But something shifted behind the composure. Some tectonic thing, a plate moving that didn't usually move. That's a serious allegation, he said. His voice was steady. He was working to keep it steady, and she could see the work. It's not an allegation. It's a documented case file currently in the possession of a federal judge who has known Silas Hawthorne for 20 years and has no reason to doubt the provenance of evidence presented to him by a former law clerk who kept copies of everything. She let that sit for a moment. Everything, Victor. The creek ran beside them, indifferent. Somewhere up the road behind him, she could feel the weight of 6 armed men and the thin distance between the current situation and a worse one. You should be careful, Victor said, about making claims you can't. The bank in Helena confirmed the Aldrin account this week. The Cook County Courthouse has the original Illinois filings that match my copies exactly. The correspondence address for Aldrin in Hartwell routes to Box 44 at the postal office, which you opened in March of 1883. She watched his face. I know because I kept the letter with the box number in it. You sent it from your office. You signed it Thomas Aldrin, and you forgot that your own letterhead was on the page. The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had heard in 11 years. Victor Crow looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time, with the appraisal he'd never bothered to apply to a woman he'd considered irrelevant since the day she was born. She watched him calculate, watched him try to find the angle, the counter, the maneuver, and watched him fail to find it because there wasn't one. There was no angle available when the documentation was complete and in a judge's hands, and the only question remaining was timing. You can't prove the estate fraud without, I have 7 documents showing the transfer of capital from my mother's estate account to accounts you controlled through the Aldrin identity. I have your attorney's notes from 2 of the meetings. He dictated, and I transcribed, and I kept the transcription. Her voice didn't waver. It had waited 11 years for this conversation, and it knew exactly what it was doing. Mr. Hollis, who was junior partner at the firm at the time, is currently practicing in Springfield and has already been contacted by Judge Cade's clerk. He remembers the Whitlock estate matter. He found it troubling at the time. Something broke in Victor's face then. Not visibly. You wouldn't see it unless you'd been watching for it the way she'd been watching for it for 11 years. But it broke. She felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives. What do you want? He said. And that was it. That was the question. That was Victor Crow, who had never in his life asked anyone what they wanted because he'd never been in a position of needing to. Asking Eleanor Whitlock what she wanted while sitting his horse on a creek road in Montana with 6 hired men at his back and a federal warrant somewhere between Helena and here. She took a breath. I want this ranch left alone. I want the water authority dispute withdrawn. I want the Aldrin accounts unfrozen and returned to their rightful claimant once the legal process establishes provenance. She looked at him. I want you to stop. And if I do, the legal process continues regardless of what you do, she said. I want you to understand that. This isn't a negotiation. The case is already in motion. What you do in the next few hours affects only how this ends for you, not whether it ends. He stared at her. She heard it before he did, or before he let himself hear it. The sound of riders coming from the south. Not from the ranch, from the direction of the main road, coming at a pace that had authority in it. Victor heard it then. She watched him hear it, watched his head turn toward the sound with the particular controlled movement of a man managing his own face in front of an audience. 4 riders came around the bend from the south road, and they were wearing the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The lead rider had a badge that caught the morning light, and the 3 behind him had the posture of men who have ridden a long way with a specific purpose and have arrived at the purpose and are now simply executing it. U.S. Marshal William Tate was a lean, gray-bearded man who looked like he'd been made specifically for difficult terrain and difficult situations and had no strong feelings about either. He pulled up on the road and looked at Victor Crow and then at Eleanor standing between them, and he held up a document. "Victor Crow," he said. Not a question. Victor's jaw worked once. "Yes." Federal examination warrant for the financial records and accounts associated with Victor Crow and Thomas Aldrin, issued by Territorial Judge Harlan Cade. Marshal Tate held the document steady. "I'm also serving notice that the Aldrin accounts at the Helena Territorial Bank are frozen pending examination. Mr. Crow, I need you to accompany me." The 6 hired men at the fence had ridden up the road at the sound of approaching riders, and they were now arranged in a loose cluster behind Crow, and everyone in the road did the same calculation at the same time. 6 men against 4 marshals, and a federal warrant is not a calculation that ends well for the 6 men, because the 6 men go home when they're paid and the 4 marshals don't go home until the job is done. One of the hired men peeled away from the group and started back down the road toward Hartwell, then another. By the time Marshal Tate spoke again, 4 of the 6 were gone, which was the truest possible commentary on the difference between loyalty and employment. The remaining 2 looked at Victor. Victor Crow looked at Eleanor. She had expected, in the version of this moment she'd carried for 11 years, to feel something large. Triumph or relief or the particular vindication of a long wrong finally righted. What she actually felt was smaller and quieter than any of that. It was closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy. Not joy, not victory, just the absence of a weight that had been there so long she'd incorporated it into her posture. "This isn't finished," Victor said to her. His voice was controlled. He would hold that control until the end because it was the last thing he had. "For you it is," she said. Marshal Tate moved his horse alongside Crow's with the calm efficiency of a man who has done this many times and finds it neither dramatic nor particularly satisfying. Tres just work. The 2 remaining hired men exchanged a look and chose, correctly, to ride away. Eleanor stood in the creek road and watched Victor Crow ride away between federal marshals, and the silver-handled cane was still across his saddle, and the coat was still immaculate, and he still held his back straight, and none of it meant what it had meant an hour ago. She stood there for a moment after they disappeared around the bend. Just a moment. The creek ran beside her with complete indifference to the resolution of 11 years of her life. Then she turned and walked back toward Iron Ridge Ranch. Silas was at the gate. He'd watched the whole thing from the fence line, the conversation, the marshals arriving, Crow leaving, with the expression of a man doing the specific work of not intervening in something that doesn't need his intervention. It was probably the hardest thing she could have asked him to do, and he had done it, which was not nothing. She came through the gate, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Pete Garner cleared his throat and found something to look at on the horizon. Bobby made a small sound that might have been relief and turned it into a cough. "The water access," Eleanor said. "The notice will need to be formally withdrawn through the county. That should happen in the next few days once Cade's warrant is on record." "I know," Silas said. "And the Aldrin account examination will take some time. The legal process for establishing provenance on the estate money." "Eleanor," his voice was quiet, "could be several months before—" "Eleanor," quieter still. She stopped. She was doing the thing she did when she was managing something she didn't know how to not manage, filling the available space with the next problem and the next, because the next problem was easier than whatever was happening in the pause between problems. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about the honest answer to that question, which was complicated and multidirectional and not entirely available to her yet. She thought about Victor's face at the moment he understood it was over, and the weight she'd set down, and the strange smallness of the feeling she'd expected to be large. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in a week." He nodded. That was something she'd come to depend on, his acceptance of a partial answer, when a partial answer was the truthful one. He didn't push for resolution she didn't have. He just accepted the accuracy of "I think so" and let it be what it was. "Come inside," he said. "You've been in the saddle for 2 days." She followed him into the ranch house, and Bobby held the door, and Pete was already talking to the Alcott brothers about getting back to work. And Iron Ridge Ranch was doing the thing it had always done, Sats. Continuing forward, finding its next task, because a ranch doesn't stop for anything for long. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were different. The formal withdrawal of the Water Authority dispute came through the county office 8 days after Victor's arrest, which was 4 days faster than Eleanor had expected, and suggested that the officials who'd been cooperating with Crow had developed a rapid interest in distance from his affairs. The Hartwell County Land Office quietly amended several recent filings. 2 men who'd been appointed to minor county positions by Crow's influence resigned within a month. The legal examination in Helena moved slowly, as these things do, with the particular grinding patience of institutional process. Eleanor exchanged letters with Judge Cade's office twice a month. She exchanged one letter with Mr. Hollis in Springfield, who had confirmed the estate matter in his deposition and had added in a handwritten note at the bottom that was not part of the legal document that he had often thought about the capable clerk who'd been let go and had wondered what had become of her. She wrote back briefly and told him. She didn't tell him everything. Some things don't require their complete telling. Victor Crow was indicted on federal fraud charges in January. The process of unwinding the Aldrin accounts took the better part of a year. What came back to Eleanor from her mother's estate, what remained of it after 11 years of being capital in someone else's operation, was less than the original amount, but more than nothing, which was more than she'd let herself count on. She put it into Iron Ridge Ranch, which Silas tried to refuse and she declined to argue about. "It's not charity," she told him at the kitchen table on an evening in February when the snow was doing what Montana snow does in February. "It's investment, in something that's mine as much as yours." He looked at her across the table. "You don't have to—" "Silas." She used his name the way he sometimes used hers, as a way to mark that they had arrived at the real part of the conversation and the circling could stop. "I'm not a woman passing through. I made a decision when I got on that train. I've made more decisions since." She met his eyes. "This is where I live. This is what I'm building. The money goes into what I'm building." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the ranch in that long, low way it had in winter, finding the gaps and the corners and the places where things could be tighter. "All right," he said. "Thank you for not arguing more." "I considered arguing more." "I know you did." She stood to clear the plates. "You made the right choice." Something crossed his face that was close to a smile, closer than he usually let it get. He stood and helped her clear the table, which he did now without thinking, the way a person does things that have become part of their natural motion. Spring came the way it always came in Montana, reluctantly and then all at once, like it had been waiting to be permitted. The cattle numbers rebuilt slower than Silas would have liked, which was the honest pace of recovery, as opposed to the pace that impatience recommends. 3 new men came on, recommended by Pete, vetted by Eleanor in conversations that were so natural and practical that the men being vetted generally didn't realize it was happening. Bobby asked Eleanor to formally teach him to cook, which she did on Sunday afternoons without treating it as remarkable. He was good at it. She told him so, which mattered to him in the way that being told you're good at something matters when it comes from someone who doesn't give that assessment lightly. The town of Hartwell recalibrated. Small towns always do. They're more practical about reputation than they appear, and a man who'd built his standing on money that turned out to be fraudulently acquired loses that standing with the same efficiency that the money is clawed back. The laughter on the train platform became the kind of thing that the people who'd laughed didn't mention and didn't want mentioned. Eleanor didn't require them to apologize. She didn't require anything from Hartwell except to be left alone to do her work, which was the only requirement she'd ever had of most places. There was a morning in April when she was on the porch doing the accounts, a task she'd taken over from Silas in February at his unspoken relief, because numbers were something she spoke fluently and he spoke adequately, and there was no reason to speak adequately when fluency was available. and Silas came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down in the other chair without asking whether she wanted company. She'd noticed he'd stopped asking whether she wanted company around the same time she'd stopped being surprised by his presence. These things happen gradually in working households, between people who are paying attention to each other without making a performance of it. "Creek's running well," he said. "I saw. Fence on the east side needs work before summer. I put it on the list last week." He drank his coffee. She did the accounts. The morning was the particular clear cold of Montana April that knows warmth is coming but isn't ready to commit to it yet. A hawk made a long, lazy circuit over the north field and then went somewhere more interesting. "Eleanor," Silas said. "I want to say something." She looked up from the accounts. His face was doing the thing it did when he was approaching territory he wasn't practiced in. Not uncomfortable exactly, but careful, the way he was careful on uncertain ground. "I know the arrangement we made wasn't what either of us would have chosen if circumstances had been different," he said. "I know you came here because it was useful, and I know I wrote to that agency because the ranch needed what it needed." He stopped, started again. "I just want you to know that what this has become, for me, it's not that arrangement anymore. It hasn't been for a while." She was quiet for a moment. The account sat in her lap, the column of numbers waiting patiently. "I know," she said. "You know." "I've known for a while." She looked at him. "I wasn't sure you did." Something in his face shifted, and the thing that had been close to a smile in February finally arrived all the way. It wasn't a large smile. He wasn't a man built for large smiles. But it was real, and it was his, and she had been watching it approach for 5 months and was glad it had gotten here. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know that." "No," she agreed. "Neither am I. We manage." "We do," she said. "Reasonably well, I think." "Better than reasonably?" She allowed that. She looked back at the accounts. He looked at the north field. The hawk came back around, and this time seemed satisfied with what it found. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. It was the kind of enough that people who have lived through genuinely difficult things understand. Not the cinematic resolution, not the grand declaration, but the ordinary morning with coffee and the accounts and someone sitting in the other chair who has decided, without making an announcement about it, to stay. Iron Ridge Ranch did not become perfect. Nothing does. The summer brought a dry spell that worried everyone for 6 weeks before the rains came. There was a dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line that took 3 months to resolve and cost more in legal fees than the land in question was probably worth. But some arguments are about the principle, and some principles require finishing. Pete Garner broke his arm in August falling off a horse in a way that he refused to discuss in detail and that Bobby would occasionally bring up when Pete was being particularly unreasonable about something, which was an effective tool. The east fence got fixed in June, which was on schedule. The kitchen got the repair to the left side of the stove that Eleanor had identified in her first week, which brought the whole operation up to a standard that the food had always deserved. Cookie, who had gotten genuinely sober with the kind of grinding difficulty that real sobriety involves, came back in a different capacity, not as the primary cook, but as something between kitchen help and general ranch hand, a role that seemed to fit him better than the one he'd had before. He was not a transformed man. He was a somewhat improved man, which is the realistic version of recovery. Victor Crow's trial concluded in November. Eleanor read the verdict letter in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning alone, because Silas was out with the cattle and Pete was mending something and Bobby was in town. She read it through once, and then she folded it carefully and held it for a moment, and then she set it on the table and put the kettle on for coffee. Silas found her there when he came in an hour later, the letter still on the table, the coffee finished. He read the letter, he set it back down. He didn't say, "I told you so," or "It's over," or "Justice was served," which was the kind of thing people say when they want to provide a conclusion to something that has already reached its own conclusion and doesn't need the label. He said none of that. He put his hand over hers on the table, just that. She turned her hand over and held his, and the kitchen was warm and the ranch outside was doing its living, and Iron Ridge went on in the way of things that have survived what they were not supposed to survive. Not triumphant, not gilded, just standing. That was enough. That, in the end, is almost always enough. The woman who had been laughed at on a train platform on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1886 was still here in November of 1887, and the ranch she had walked into half-broken was something different now. Not because anything magical had happened, because two people had worked at it, imperfectly, sometimes sideways, occasionally at cross purposes, and had kept working. The people of Hartwell, who had made their assessments quickly and revised them slowly, as people do, had developed a different understanding of Eleanor Hawthorne than the one they'd brought to the train platform. She didn't cultivate their opinion, she didn't need it, but she was present in the life of the valley in a way that accumulated its own weight, the way competence and steadiness accumulate weight when they're consistently applied in a place where people are watching whether they mean to be or not. Some things you earn loudly, some things you earn by still being there. Eleanor Hawthorne was still there. She would be there tomorrow and the day after, making accounts add up and kitchens run, and difficult situations yield to the particular force of clear-eyed patience. She was not a legend, not a symbol, not a story that got prettier with each telling. She was a woman who had carried something heavy for a long time and had found, eventually, a place to set it down and something worth picking up instead. Outside Iron Ridge Ranch turned toward winter. It was ready.